First Chechen War, which lasted from 1994 to 1996, was post-Soviet Russia's first significant large-scale conflict. After a tenuous peace, which resembled only a pause in hostilities, it was followed by the Second Chechen War that lasted from 1999 to 2009. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia became an independent successor state to a large swath of territory. At the same time, it inherited the threat of further political disintegration. Within the new federal structure, many republics demanded autonomy, and even some outright independence. One of such republics was Chechnya. The Russian involvement in the Caucasus dates to the Tsarist times. In the late 18th century, Russia began to conquer the region in a brutal, protracted invasion which killed half of its inhabitants. The strategy employed during Tsarist Russia revolved around building of forts in the countryside, cutting off communication between clans, and systematic destruction of foodstuffs leading to many famines. Despite retaining control, violence was still periodic until 1944, when Stalin deployed most of the Chechen people to Siberia and Central Asia, where 1/3 of the population perished in exile. Those that survived did not return to their homeland until 1957. Therefore, the Chechen struggle against the Russian imperialism was not only a transitory feature, but part of a long-term historical pattern. Once conflict returned to the region in 1994, it evoked long-lasting memories from both the Chechens and the Russians. Chechen nationalism lay dormant during the communist years, but immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Chechnya declared independence and elected former Soviet Air Force Major General Dudayev as its president. Russia initially suspected that Dudayev could be an ally, but it soon grew dismayed as he rejected any compromise, including maintaining almost complete autonomy at the cost of remaining within the federal structure of Russia. If you ask me, he seems to have Russia pretty well figured out.
Конечно, планы в России были и аппетиты широкие и раньше, но осеклись на Афганистане. Знаете, как в анекдоте муравей перевязанный идет, а кумарик спрашивает: что с тобой, Мурик, дорогой? Что случилось? Да, было дело. Хотел светлячка отведать, да на окурок нарвался. Вот так нарвались на Афганистан, и аппетиты немножко поубавились. А когда погорели на Афганистане, то решили изменить политику, привлечь Европу на свою сторону, идеологи и политики, и заигрывать с Европой, чтобы усилиться до Индийского океана, Ближнего Востока, Босфора, Красного моря, а потом шлепнуть и Европу. Афганистан, а потом и другие трудности, а потом еще теперь Ичкерия. Ичкерия поубавила немножко аппетиты, но не приостановила. В Крыму еще будет бойня. Украина еще схлестнется с Россией на непримиримых. Пока русизм существует, он никогда не откажется от своих амбиций. Вот сейчас вот славянская там под этой маркой хотят подмять, как и в прежние времена, опять Украину, Белоруссию, окрепнуть и там далее. Теперь с Россией никто и в союзе военном, не только военном, и в экономическом, и в политическом, и даже в торговом отношении никто не хочет быть. Уж хорошо изучили.
In Moscow, Chechen independence was viewed as a destabilizing element to Russia's national security, primarily because many feared a domino effect where other republics would follow the secessionist tendencies of Chechnya. If that occurred, Moscow feared that the Russian state would crumble. This is most evidently noted by Boris Yeltsin, who viewed Russian security in terms of its vast territory that had been painstakingly accumulated through centuries, mostly through conquest. Accordingly, from Moscow's perspective, the conflict was always an internal affair and an existential threat to its security. By contrast, the Chechen government viewed the war as a struggle for independence from century-long Russian rule. While most Russian senior leaders viewed Chechnya as part of Russia, and its people as Russian citizens, the beginning of hostilities proved that they had underestimated the depth of the Chechen ethnic identity. Soviet citizenship, previously forced, did not mean automatic acquiescence to Russian citizenship. Chechen nationalists considered themselves Chechens. The Russian forces, however, were comprised mostly of Russian conscript soldiers. Moreover, in the post-1991 period, there were many instances of public animosity throughout Russia towards the Chechens, especially when President Yeltsin restored to the Russian Cossacks living in the southern Russia the Tsarist-era status of local paramilitary units. The subsequent differentiation between Russian and non-Russians did not decrease tensions. Other factors included Russian ignorance of local history and the social structure of the Chechens, which was clan-based and exceedingly independent. Russian military involvement began with operations below the threshold of conflict. This was defined using a variety of coercive measures, whose purpose was to force a political solution to the conflict. In the summer of 1994, Russia began supporting anti-Dudayev opposition groups with weapons, culminating in the deployment of Russian mercenaries, who often happened to be active duty soldiers. Those little green men popping up over and over again. Afterwards, Russia began sending more overt support, such as air intelligence gathering and limited air attacks. The arrival of Russian mercenaries and their failed storming of Grozny on November 26, 1994, signified the end of covert measures. At that point, the Russians began planning for a conventional invasion. Unbeknownst to the Russian military, instead of weakening Dudayev, the involvement of Russian mercenaries consolidated his support. Due to the secretive nature of the Russian decision-making process, there is little first-hand evidence on who precisely made the decision for the invasion of Chechnya. However, by observing Russian actions, it seems clear that there was a drastic shift from coercive measures to a strategy of annihilation and leadership targeting. The shift that signified this change was the destruction of all Chechen air assets on November 28, 1994, only 2 days after the failed storming of Grozny. Although the Russian Air Force had little trouble eliminating 266 enemy aircraft, Russian ground troops did not begin to move until December the 11th. Local resistance on the way to the capital also slowed them down, which forced a revision of their schedule. In the end, Russian troops reached Grozny only on the 26th of December, therefore allowing ample time for the defenders to prepare and losing any semblance of surprise. Once they approached Grozny, the Russian military forces staged a three-pronged attack on the Chechen capital that was meant to achieve strategic effects by attacking the perceived centre of power, with the hope that the Chechen leadership would be captured. But although the Russian military appeared to plan for the encirclement, the Chechen fighters ambushed Russian armour formations, inflicting heavy casualties, with most armour personnel carriers destroyed, as many were hit with 5 or more anti-tank grenades. Russian losses were so great that they surpassed the ratio of armour losses during the Battle of Berlin in World War II. On New Year's Eve 1994, Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles poured into the streets of Grozny, with an assault expected to snuff out the self-declared Chechen Republic of Chechnya, as black smoke poured into the sky from oil tanks set ablaze by a dawn artillery bombardment. Defence Minister Pavel Grachev had claimed the upstart Chechens would be swept away in a bloodless blitzkrieg with minimal forces. But the forces entering Grozny from 4 axes were far from minimal. Counting elements from 7 motorised rifle regiments and 1 independent brigade mounted in wheeled BTR-80 armoured personnel carriers and tracked BMP-2 fighting vehicles, 2 tank battalions with T-72 and T-80 main battle tanks, and 2 parachute regiments. Surely such firepower would brush away the estimated 100 or so Chechen fighters supporting an upstart pro-independence government based in Grozny. However, for the young Russian men attacking Grozny, which in Russian translates to terrible, the city truly earned its name. The people of Grozny were woken before dawn by a thundering bombardment crashing around them. It was New Year's Eve 1994, and they should have been preparing for what was traditionally their biggest holiday of the year. Instead, from 5 AM until mid-morning, they cowered as attack aircraft roared overhead, diving low to hurl bombs at the city. For nearly 3 weeks, Russian tanks had been massing on the ridges above Grozny, as Moscow called on the Chechen separatist fighters to surrender and disarm. The embattled president of Chechnya, Dudayev, locked in a dangerous game of brinksmanship with Russian President Boris Yeltsin, had moved his office into the bunker of his presidential palace, but was refusing to back down on his bid for independence from Russia. Dudayev had declared his tiny mountainous republic independent when he came into power in 1991. Now Russian tanks had invaded Chechnya to force him out of office, and some 6,000 troops were moving in on his city. Over 1,000 men of Russia's 131st Maikop Brigade had spent the night on the fields just north of Grozny. Poised to advance at dawn, Viktor Kim, a 19-year-old conscript in command of a unit of 4, driving a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, received the order to move at 6:40 a.m. Their task was to take the airport, and they moved across the open fields to it with surprising ease. When they met no opposition, they were told to head into the centre of the town and occupy the railway station. Nikolai Ryabatsev was in the 1st Battalion that pressed onto the centre. Driving slowly in a column of 30 vehicles, tanks, armoured troop carriers and self-propelled guns rumbling on their thick tank treads. A big, tall 19-year-old Ryabatsev had started his military service 6 months before, one of tens of thousands of barely trained conscripts who made up the bulk of the Russian army. Now amongst the infantry, he was walking alongside the column, sometimes hopping back onto his armoured personnel carrier to ride a few blocks. They then turned onto the wide avenue, which you're pissing in the wind if you think I've got any opportunity or chance of pronouncing, that leads from the northwest into the city. People were watching from their balconies, but the streets were deserted, with no traffic at all. By mid-morning, the whole sky over Grozny was black. A noxious blanket of oily smoke poured from fierce fires burning on the west side of the city, where bombs had hit the oil refinery's storage tanks. The smoke hung low over the city, a line of bright light only showing at the horizon. The Oil Institute in the centre of Grozny was on fire, the top floors blazing orange and red, billowing thick smoke across the central square, reducing visibility for the men guarding the palace. Tank fire was now landing in the city centre, pounding the buildings at 30-second intervals.
Фильм, который вы сейчас увидите, мы назвали «60 часов Майкоповской бригады». Столько времени прошло с того момента, когда 31 декабря бригада входила в город с задачей взять железнодорожный вокзал, и до 2 января вечером, когда из города вышли те, кто сумел остаться в живых. В фильме использованы аудио и видеозаписи, собранные нами из разных источников, а также съемки, которые производились нами в городе Грозном в начале марта, когда основные бои ушли на восток, а город контролировался войсками в светлое время суток.
Алик, давай, может быть, как-нибудь, пока не поздно, отведите ребят, Алик, не делайте это, не надо. Вы в любом случае, Алик, пойми, и ты погибнешь, и я погибну. Что с этого толку будет? Сам правильно пойми, кто от этого выиграет? Мы же от этого с тобой не выиграем, понимаешь? Если я тебя увижу в бою, понимаешь, что ты отлично, не отлично, уже я тебя щадить не буду, так же, как и ты меня, понимаешь? Ты лучше ко мне как гость приедь, Алик. Отводи ребят, не надо, пожалей их матерей, пожалей их самих, отводи ребят, Алик, дай команду.
Ну, я не такой большой начальник, чтобы давать такие команды.
Алик, ну ты правильно пойми, я, например, тебе просто от сердца, да, и чисто желаю, чтобы ты живой, конечно, остался, но уйди лучше.
А я такого выбора не имею. У меня есть приказ, и я его выполню в любом случае.
The massive Soviet-style concrete building of the presidential palace was the nerve centre of the Chechen resistance. Its extensive, well-protected bunker serving as the headquarters of the defence of Grozny. Ahmed, a commander of the Chechen Presidential Guard, was on duty on New Year's Eve. A group of Russian parliamentary deputies arrived mid-morning to consult with the Chechen leadership in what was becoming an increasingly hopeless attempt to try to avert the destruction of the city. Around lunchtime, Ahmed was in the main entrance hall of the palace when someone ran in saying tanks were coming down the street. The men with grenade launchers ran to take up positions, and Ahmed, armed only with a Kalashnikov, leapt up the stairs to a lookout point on the first floor. Standing in a corner room overlooking the square and the side street, he watched a Chechen fighter fire an anti-tank grenade on an armoured troop carrier. 4 soldiers spilled out the burning vehicle, and Ahmed and another fighter fired from the second floor, mowing down the Russian soldiers before they could take cover. Tanks and armoured troop carriers coming along behind tried to turn around, jerkily reversing over pavements to get away. One of the two Ukrainian fighters who had into the rumble of the approaching armour. When someone with a grenade launcher opened fire, disabling a tank, fighters erupted from their hiding places all along the street to ambush the stragglers. Across town on Premikovskaya Street, along Broad Avenue leading in from the airport, another fierce battle was raging where the 81st Motor Rifle Regiment came under ambush as it drove into town. Strung out for a mile along the avenue, the whole column came under fire from Chechen fighters positioned all the way down. Fighters were suddenly on the attack, running out in search of more tanks, plundering what did not burn for weapons and ammunition. By evening they gathered in the centre of town, swarming around the marketplace and moving towards the railway station. The Maikop Brigade had occupied Grozny's railway station by early afternoon, parking its tanks and APCs in the square in front, facing the presidential palace. Several hundred yards away, they were unaware that they were a target for a very hostile and fierce Chechen resistance. Some members of the presidential guard even remember one Russian soldier poking his head out of the tank hatch to ask them where he could buy cigarettes. The Chechens answered him with a bullet to his head. The Chechens took up positions in the depot buildings behind the railway station, the post office to the right, and the 5-storey building opposite. Over the radio they called on the Russians to surrender, warning them they were surrounded, but the Russians replied they had their orders and would not. Ryabatsev was standing under the arch of the railway building when a bullet nicked his uniform. It was early evening still. He remembered it began slowly, with sniper fire and machine guns rattling from nearby buildings. As the Russians answered with big guns mounted on their armoured vehicles, the Chechens blasted them from the side with rocket-propelled grenade launchers. Within hours, the square returned into a horrific inferno of dead bodies and burning tanks. A Russian private was shot in the legs trying to haul a heavy machine gun into the railway station building. He dragged himself behind the tanks and was pulled in through the window to a room that filled rapidly with wounded soldiers. Another young conscript was inside his light tank firing the gun when an anti-tank grenade seared into the side, bursting like a fireball. His clothes on fire, his face and hands scorched. He yanked open the hatch at the back and leapt out, stumbling over the dead bodies of his comrades as he dashed blindly into the station building. Badly burnt, he joined the growing number of wounded in the impromptu field hospital as the fighting raged through the night. Ryabatsev remembers drifting in and out of sleep, hearing loud explosions, and someone saying another tank had been hit. The commander of the brigade, Colonel Ivan Savin, radioed all night for reinforcements, but none came. Kim's unit only made it to the station at 5 in the morning, but was in no position to help. His vehicle was hit in the street by the presidential palace around 3 in the afternoon. His team leapt free and made it into the light tank ahead. 15 of them then took cover in a building until the early hours of the morning, when they managed to duck and weave their way to the station buildings. At midnight, the men stopped for 15 minutes while their commander offered them a swig of vodka. It was by now New Year's Day, but they had little to celebrate. Patrick Chauvel, a French photographer, walked into Grozny at dawn on New Year's Day. He was the only independent journalist with the fighters in the centre of the city that day, and he found the hunt for Russian tanks still going on. The 3rd Battalion of the Maikop Brigade, some 40 tanks and armoured vehicles, finally responded to calls for help and headed into Grozny mid-morning to try and break through to the station. Like the 2nd Battalion, they never made it and were blasted at close quarters as they trundled down the surrounding streets. Warned by those in the station to avoid the presidential palace, they cut down side streets, only to run into more ambushes. With no idea what to do, where to take cover or how to break out of the nightmare, soldiers were thrown into panic. Tank drivers backed frantically away to hide, crashing over pavements and through courtyards in a desperate attempt to get to safety. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade. Tanks careered wildly down the streets, often lost, reversing in panic when they saw trouble, yanking their machine guns round and firing in all directions. Some soldiers dived into nearby buildings, barricading themselves into the basements. "They are hiding like chickens," one fighter laughed scornfully. The Chechens would hit the first tank and the Russians in the tanks behind would run into nearby buildings to escape. There was a crazy game of hide and seek, with Russian soldiers hiding in bunkers, apartments and even toilets to escape, and the Chechens hunting them down with swords, knives and pistols. There were lots of tanks hiding in backyards and behind walls. The Chechens said they were waiting for night time. They let lots of tanks in, then blocked the streets. They wanted to capture them. The Russian soldiers were so poorly trained that when fighting erupted, they were incapable of defending themselves. None of the 18 and 19-year-old conscript soldiers had any training for urban warfare and had no idea of the dangers. We only practiced shooting lying flat in a field, Zarovny said bitterly, as 2 years later he watched documentary film of Chechen fighters firing from multi-story buildings. They were also totally unprepared for the grenade attacks on their tanks. For all their heavy weaponry, their communications and backup were abysmal, and isolated units blundered around without orders, even clashing with each other. The Chechens, by comparison, were fearless and often merciless. Natural marksmen who learned to handle a gun as young boys, they picked off fleeing soldiers easily. Hundreds of volunteers ran in to grab weapons from dead Russian soldiers, especially seeking the prized sniper rifles with night sights. The more experienced hacking off the big machine guns from the armoured vehicles. Shelling picked up at around 2 PM on New Year's Day and pounded on until dark. The Maikop Brigade was now under desperate pressure as the Chechens began hitting the station building where they were all sheltering. Colonel Savin called in artillery strikes to the immediate area around the station, but it did little to ease his predicament. "They are firing from all sides. Where is the assistance? The whole battalion is wounded and lying in the station," he radioed, his voice cracking under the strain. "Think about how to get all the wounded out. We have no vehicles left, do you understand? Work out how to get the wounded out. We are all dying. We need help. Do you understand?" he said in one of his last radio messages. After dark, he finally decided to evacuate the wounded to the only armoured vehicle still working. 2 soldiers helped another hobble along the length of the station. 2 more were carried in blankets. A total of 40 wounded men were loaded up. The badly wounded were lying inside. The rest, somehow clinging on top. One of the only officers to survive sat at the front behind the driver. They left at speed, then suddenly stopped and turned back the way they had come, as the major in command reckoned they were heading the wrong way. We turned round and we were going back into the centre of town. They were in fact less than half a mile from a Russian paratroop regiment who had set up base in a park. As they slowed to turn a corner, fighters caught them with several grenades. Soldiers spilled off in all directions as the APC crashed to a stop and gunfire broke out. Several tried to make a run for it. Zarovny, his wounded hands in bandages, guiding a friend who was blinded. They tried to climb a wall, only to come face to face with an armed Chechen. Kim dived into the drain. Krimzade, badly wounded, could not move. Ryabetsev alone got away to an apartment building. He found some Chechen civilians who took him in, but they alerted the nearest fighters, who came for him minutes later. Only 13 of the 40 wounded survived to be taken prisoner. Savin abandoned the railway station on the evening of the 2nd of January, leaving on foot with the remaining officers and soldiers until they found several abandoned armoured vehicles. They headed out of town, but they were too caught by the Chechens. The colonel died on the street from shrapnel wounds beside his wrecked vehicle. The entire Maikop Brigade, over 1,000 men, had been wiped out in just 60 hours. Now, obviously, this upload has been a bit different to what was originally planned. Basically, I've worked out finally, after about 4 months of doing this, a system of how to sort of put my videos together. I hope that it's been noticed, that the video's tracked better, and that it's been visually better for you all. I'm sorry for the length of time this took. I appreciate everyone's continued support, encouragement, and definitely patience. We will continue with this. We'll pick up from where this one had left off, going through the whole Chechen wars. So thank you all once again. Slava Ukraini. Herium Slava.